Okay, so let me make sure that indeed is being recorded. Yes. So, welcome to Gender to a T. It's a speaker series designed to help gender-focused researchers by fielding questions from attendees about the presenter's ongoing unpublished research. The series, which is free and open to the public, is sponsored by the Gender Studies Program, the Gender Studies Executive Board, and the Harriet College of Arts and Sciences. And again, I'm going to be recording the presentation. I'll be posting it on Gender Studies social media. And we're happy to have everybody here. Thank you so much. And I'm excited to introduce Dr. Jonathan Reid from History, who is also the director of ECU's Medieval and Renaissance Studies program. He will present Without Women and Children, No Reformation in France. And he's written extensively on Marguerite de Navarre. Is that how you pronounce it? A
De
prolific
Navarre, yeah, you don't pronounce the
writer.
final E, yeah.
Okay. I'm from the South. Dee Navarre, a prolific writer and patron, and other elite 16th century women involved in Renaissance and Reform movements. And so I will hand it over to you.
Thank you very much, Cheryl, for giving me the opportunity to present, and also to the Gender Studies program. And thanks to all of you for coming out for this, and also any of you who may be listening to the recording. I do want to apologize. This date falls on Yom Kippur, and that has prevented some people from attending. And I apologize for that, and wish them a very meaningful High Holy Day. So I am going to share my screen now. And first, I'm going to give you a little introduction how I got into this project. I'm going to read for about 28 minutes over PowerPoints the selections from this chapter that I've written. And if there is time at the end, see if I can get into an example of a proof of concept test case. So the title of this chapter is Without Women and Children, No Reformation in France. And my previous research, as Cheryl just announced, has focused on a figure, Margaret de Navarre, who is King Francis I's sister and leader of a broad evangelical reform movement within France at about the same time period of Henry VIII in England, if you're wanting to situate this in the 16th century. And I've written a book on her and several follow-up articles on her agency and the people with whom she has worked. My major ongoing project focuses, actually, though, at present on the Reformation in France from roughly 1520 to 1562. And it is a research project focused on cities or city reformations, which is one of the classic paradigms in Reformation history, especially in Germany. And I've chosen this period because it is the period leading up to or prior to what are known the first of the wars of religion in France. And it's vastly understudied. So my choice in selecting this project dictated that I do some longitudinal research in archives and with printed primary sources and secondary literature, of course. And I chose to focus on, you'll see on the map, several towns, Rouen, Poitiers, Bourges, and a few others I'll mention in a moment, where there were very strong reform movements and likely to be good sources. And so these are Amiens, which is in the north of France, Rouen, Bourges, and Poitiers that I pointed to. And there's a particularity about this history in terms of the way things developed in France. There was a long, slow underground growth of this movement, and then really explosive growth, both in the formation of fully reformed, standalone Reformed or Calvinist churches from though it started in 1555 and a little before, really accelerated in 1559 to 62, just before the war, during a period when there was political instability. The King of France died, Henry II died in 1559, leaving minor sons who were the playthings of nobles at court. And that's all well-known history. So when I received the invitation from Kirsi Stirna, a major scholar of women in the Reformation, to contribute to this collective work on women reformers, I decided, instead of going back to Marguerite, to center my studies on everyday, that is, non-headliner women, the ones who kept on cropping up in my research as part of an investigation of the roles of lay people in the formation of the evangelical movement and reform communities during that period. Okay, and as I tried to gather my data together, do the historiographical research, and formulate this, I realized a few things, and they sort of structure the presentation that comes next. The first is there's a real gap in the historiography about the agency of everyday women. This is compounded by the difficulty of the sources and the analog search that one does through archival material and printed primary sources and the like. And in the process of doing all of this, it dawned on me that there really is great potential for digital humanities to give us tools to advance this research. My hope today in this presentation actually is in presenting these findings, to get perspectives from others of you who work in different times and places and fields that may help me see some ways forward in terms of analysis of data, as well as any of you who have expertise in digital humanities tools and ways of processing data generated that way. Okay, so to the, well, and one just a quick example of comparative research that could be, that seemed to me of interest was this summer I read a book by Henry Louis Gates Jr. on the Black Church, which really focuses for much of it from the Reconstruction period in the US to the present. And one of the major things he argues in there is that women were key players in the development of these churches, though they were excluded from the leadership of the Black church for long periods of time and really had to fight their way in, and that consequently they've been understudied. So it seemed like the paradigm I'm looking at for the 16th century has resonances in other times and places. Okay, so I'm going to turn to my presentation and start with the historiography part. Since the 1970s, there has been a tsunami of scholarship on women in the Reformation. This modern wave has made major contributions to the religious, social, cultural, and political history of early modern Europe. This research has also been uneven. The experiences of English women, nuns, radical women from early 16th century German Anabaptists, to 17th century English Quakers and elite women everywhere have been by far the most studied, in large part because these groups either generated more sources or stand out as exceptional. And this is the table of the contents for the work to which I've contributed. And you'll see in blue all the individual names of women presented, and then the few cases in which some of us have looked at women more globally in the Reformation. My chapter introduces the understudied involvement of everyday women in the growth phase of the Reformation in France, one of Europe's most purely popular ground-up manifestations of Protestantism. It focuses on the period 1520 to 62, that is from the first echoes of Luther's protest to just before the advent of the Wars of Religion. By 1562, despite severe repression, which made joining the movement hazardous and potentially very costly, the Reformed community had grown to have about 1,250 churches. Its 1.5 million members, or 1.5 to 2 million members, comprised about 10% of France's population. And they were concentrated in cities and towns, making it up therein sizable minorities, sometimes majorities. Since Natalie Zeman Davis's brilliant sketch in 1975 of City Women and Religious Change, the quest to investigate women's beliefs, actions, and roles in the building of the movement, however, has long been impeded by the limitation of the sources. The advent of digital scholarship augurs major progress. Before turning to examples of this bright future, two vignettes prized from archival documents help illustrate the problem of finding everyday women's involvement in the Reformation in France. So, in early May 1560, the large clandestine church at Rouen tried several ways to gain recognition. Its leaders had a copy of the Reformed Confession of Faith and a petition slipped anonymously into the docket of the region's royal court, the Parliament of Normandy. In the petition, they requested the king's permission to worship freely and boasted that the Reformed Protestants of Rouen, France's second largest city, were part of a national movement comprising, quote, more than 500,000 men without counting women and children, end quote. Instead of mentioning that the movement also had powerful noble allies, including Jeanne d'Albret and her husband Charles de Bourbon, first Prince of the Blood, and his brother, the Prince of Condé, the Rouen church leaders made this threatening assertion about the impressive size of the national movement, which echoes Jesus' miraculous feeding of the 5,000, quote unquote, besides women and children in Matthew 14:21. This threat was far less troubling to Parliament officials than the fact that from Lent into May, June, and July of that year, in direct defiance of royal orders, humble folk, that is, menu peuple, men, women, and children, from the Reformed community kept gathering directly under their noses by the hundreds, sometimes thousands, near the cathedral and in other public places to sing the psalms and attend outdoor sermons. In telling contrast to their timid leaders' direct attempt to gain recognition from royal officials, everyday folk were boldly demonstrating to all of Rouen's people the local church's existence, strength, and determination. This season of public manifestation was, in a sense, the rank and file's months-long coming out party after decades of growth underground. To stop those illegal gatherings, the Parliament, unlike this massacre scene that I've got up on the screen, the Parliament and city officials targeted male heads of household and schoolmasters, threatening to publish them for their own actions, as well as those of the women and children in their charge. While taking these measures, the court councillors were also arguing out of the other side of their mouths, incongruously, that no, thank you very much, they did not need the crown to billet troops in the city to control the situation because, quote unquote, only common folk were involved and not, quote, the principal people of Rouen. Now, these rich anecdotes illustrate four foundational assertions argued here about the agency of women in the Reformation in France and the obstacles to our attempts to assess it. The first is, unless egregious, women's actions, especially those of commoners, so too common men, were systematically underreported or discounted in contemporary sources. As we see in the Rouen vignettes, leaders across the confessional divides shared a hierarchical and paternalistic worldview. Though sometimes acknowledged, women's involvement went literally uncounted because it was covered, that is, both dealt with and occulted in the telling of the actions of their male counterparts. Second, everyday women did act, but they did so in community. That is mostly in partnership with other women and men and young people, meaning again, women's collaborative work is often hidden in accounts of men's actions. Third, most significantly, to the extent that the Reformation in France was a mass movement, and I think it certainly was, women were massively involved. At Rouen, both the Reformed leaders and the Catholic magistrates had to acknowledge this fact, however obliquely. Fourth, lastly, in addition to source biases, as a practical matter, much of the evidence, such as it is, for the involvement of everyday women comes from difficult to use archival records, rarely from first-person accounts. Moreover, while some police records have been studied or edited in published works, all of them, both archival works Um, both archival documents and published works are or have been until quite recently sequestered in hard to access paper copies. The tools created over the past 20 years, digital copies of documents, massive and ever multiplying electronic databases, optical character recognition, OCR, translation apps, data tagging, data management conventions, online open access publication, sophisticated search algorithms, and artificial intelligence are precipitating a revolution in the aggregation and analysis of oceans of evidence in all domains. Beyond the advent of searchable PDFs and printed materials, archival and manuscript documents, whose vast extent in European repositories is measured in hundreds of miles of shelf space, are slowly coming online. We are on the cusp of realizing a democratized digitopia. Someday soon, all things ever written, printed, or depicted will be fully digitized, tagged with subject metadata, and accessible in research formats to everyone online. The final step towards realizing this digitopia rests in OCR conquering pre-modern handwritten documents. It will eventually. So the next part turns to the fragmentary evidence for everyday women's agency. Pick up any study of women and the Reformation, and you will find passages recounting examples of women engaging in the cause individually or in groups, small and large. Scholars have dug up instances of women attending religious services, some even leading private groups in prayer, devotions, and studying scripture. Women reading, writing, printing, or publishing religious books, women turning out at hot moments of conflict to support favored preachers, or to accompany their sisters and brothers in the faith, or to go themselves to the stake. And as in our Rouen example, women singing psalms in worship or to demonstrate the strength of the cause. Some studies have found evidence of elite women seeking legal protection, supplying arms, providing logistical and material support, and even taking up arms or leading the movement politically. So too in France. As well as elsewhere, studies have focused on elite women. And the evidence for everyday women's involvement is scattered in the era's institutional records, contemporary journals, and some 16th century published works, as well as in retrospective accounts by eyewitnesses and historians. Reporting about women in these sources is skewed in the ways indicated above. In his utterly fascinating 1,000-page chronicle of the Reformation in his home city of Troyes, Nicolas Pitou mentions only 60 women, half of whom are noble ladies making cameo appearances as their paths run through Troyes. He focuses but once on everyday women as a group, as a set piece prefacing a long description of his own actions on behalf of Troyes' beleaguered church. Pitou recounts that in 1564, the widows, unnamed, unnumbered, of men murdered during the First War of Religion and their orphaned, his term, children, lined the streets on their knees crying mercy, justice, as the Queen Mother, Catherine de' Medici, passed by. Similarly, in the 2,600-page quasi-official history of the growth of the movement to 1563, the Histoire ecclésiastique mentions femme, that is woman or women, wife or wives, 726 times, mostly in passive roles associated with men, and homme, that is man or men, 1,489 times. Among the 439 heresy cases that came before the Parliament of Paris and its burning chamber, from 1547 to 1550, judges heard only 52 cases involving some 71 women, whom, for reasons explained previously, they sentenced less harshly than men. These low rates of women appearing in the sources are not a priori because they were less active, but because male agents in the evangelical community, heretical clerics and reformed ministers, royal officials, town notables, and other men were deemed more worthy of attention. Nevertheless, a dispersed body of hard evidence about the activities of everyday women and men who enacted the Reformation is contained in such sources. Hitherto, for logistical reasons, these many scattered shreds of evidence have never been systematically assembled from paper sources or analyzed. Digital research tools can take us forward. Now, in the next part of this chapter, what I do is turn to 3 city examples where I've culled information from my own archival research and printed primary sources, OCR ones like the ones I was just showing, to try and develop a composite picture of the evolution of the movements there. And I'm going to give you just one example from the city of Amiens that let's see, not mastering my slides here, but it's the one up in northern France. So in this northern city of Picardy, the provocative teaching of a resident noble scholar, Louis de Berquin, and preaching of a cathedral canon introduced reform ideas. Both were indicted in 1523. In 1530, soon after Berquin had been executed at Paris for heresy, the Parliament of Paris received reports um, based on the testimony of 9 noblewomen and 4 noblemen that heterodox ideas were spreading widely in Amiens and nearby towns. At Amiens, the Dame, or Lady of Dorigny, was publicly calling Berquin a martyr and denying that it is necessary to confess or fast during Lent. A Dominican friar had preached suspect doctrines at another city, infecting most of the locals. The Seigneur de Cardonnet, his mother, and a learned man in their employ were similarly spreading heresy in at least 5 surrounding burghs. In one, Cardonnet had convinced several Franciscan nuns to renounce their vows and get married. Later, in the early 1530s, Jean Morin, a doctor of theology, and 2 other priests preached Lutheran doctrines to local cloth workers and their families at Amiens, gathering large followings, which had, in 1535, to be controlled by force when the formal heresy sentence against Morin was read out. In the 1540s, over 70 men and women from the trades were found to be participating in conventicles at Amiens and tried for heresy in Paris. They were asked if they had heard the Moron sermons. 2 different husband and wife teams were indicted as the masters and conveners or leaders of these conventicles, while only 1 heretical cleric was caught up in the same judicial sweeps. These groups of commoners also enjoyed some support from on high. In 1554, during one spike in persecution, a local woman, Isabeau de Rocheval, intervened in Amiens to free lowly artisans who had been taken into custody for heresy. Similarly, in the 1540s and 50s, the local bishop, François de Pisseleu, and his sister, Madame de Cany, who had estates nearby, and other notables, shielded evangelical commoners from persecution. After the First War of Religion broke out, however, when most of the local male nobles were off joining the leadership of the recently organized Reformed churches and Huguenot movement in Orléans, local authorities had a freer hand to pressure suspected Huguenots, parish by parish, house by house, to swear allegiance to the Catholic Church, to turn in their heretical books and Bibles, and to hand over their weapons or face expulsion. And this is what's on screen here is a transcription of the documents that relate this by David Rosenberg. The list of converts compiled by priests included 1,400 men and 695 women, chiefly heads of households who were overwhelmingly low-class artisans, living in the outskirts of the city, as you see on the map. As in the Rouen reports, Women and children are greatly underreported on the lists. They also fail to reflect the full extent of the movement, since not all of the Reformed converted. Over the next summer, some were later expelled or indicted for acts of iconoclasm. So too, many of those who converted under duress were insincere, since over 50% of the mothers and 60% of the fathers who appeared on the Reformed Church's baptismal records from 1564-65, that is 2 years later after the war had died down, they also had appeared on the 1562 list of converts. These lists nevertheless provide clear evidence that the Reformed movement at Amiens was large and that women were fully in the mix. Taking into account the source biases discussed above, it is clear that women were present en masse in the Reformed Church of Amiens in numbers roughly equivalent to men. Importantly, like in the other examples I study, Meaux and Rouen, this evangelical community survived and grew over long periods without significant clerical leadership. Lay men and women led the communities. And here's where I'm going to pivot to I guess, the big problematic that I'm trying to deal with, which is digital approaches to reconstructing women's contributions. Okay, so as I've said before, scholars on women in the Reformation in France, scholarship on them has been far more interested in women's leadership than their or men's mere church membership, even though that was the risky role most everyday people fulfilled, and indeed the principal goal of Reformation. That common women and men participating in or leading the movement, evidence for that is rare and fragmentary, should not be unexpected. In addition to gender prohibitions, both Catholic and Protestant authorities forbade the laity, men and women, from preaching or administering the sacraments, the two most visible and outward signs of their church. The main religious roles open to Protestant lay people involved study, devotions, prayer, participation in worship, and witnessing to other lay persons, all either passive or private activities. Moreover, from 1520 to 1560, the evangelical movement in France was clandestine. Adherents mostly hid their activities. The aggregation of evidence from relevant printed sources is now possible. There are but a handful of studies or editions of heresy, heresy trial records, printed journals and chronicles and histories written by contemporaries such as the Histoire ecclésiastique, only number a few dozen. To 1562, there are several score of printed polemical works that have data about contemporary events. Add to these a few hundred useful histories of specific towns, cities, regions, or institutions written by scholars since the 17th century, and then throw in all the relevant modern studies by modern scholars, and in total, one might end up with a few thousand, not more than 10,000 PDFs of relevant printed books and articles to include in the starter data set, a mere speck in the vastness of Digitopia. To this data set, summaries of or transcriptions of archival documents could be added as they become available, added to that data set. Meanwhile, it is feasible to proceed with printed works. Data assembled, or at least the PDFs assembled, digital research tools can be used to execute rapidly and iteratively the usual steps of gathering evidence. The goal would be to uncover everyday women acting at key moments in the life cycle of the movement. And here I'm posting on the screen because the formatting helps you to understand the argument. For evidence of women attending evangelical preaching, the catalyst that fomented most lay people's initial interest in the movement, the data can be searched by using keywords in the languages of the sources and in all their orthographic and syntactic variations, employing wildcard characters. For example, sermon, prêche, prêcher, conscio, and the like. Most useful are searches that combine relevant terms within a delimited range of words. Searches constructed along those lines would turn up instances like the cases found in the register of the Cathedral Chapter of Bourges, which relate that in 1524, quote, a great multitude of people, men and women, unquote, attended sermons there of Michel d'Arande, that in 1526, people were discussing Lutheran books in the Ducal Palace, and that in 1526, a book dealer was caught with a pile of Lutheran books for sale. Search terms all in italics there, leading to these finds. In the Histoire ecclésiastique, these in the Histoire ecclésiastique, these searches would locate the important passage relating that in 1539 at Bourges, when the king's attorney general tried to interrupt a favorite evangelical preacher, prominent women got up and threatened to hit him with their wooden stools, compelling him to shut up. Natalie Zeman Davis found a few similar cases of Protestant women disputing with or shouting down Catholic clerics. Further instances could be sought. Data assembled, it would be possible to ask whether these examples constitute a trend or were merely rare exceptions. Such instances could be compared with other Reformation experiences, such as the 5 verified cases in the 1520s of crowds of women in Antwerp and various places in German lands, protecting their evangelical preachers, sometimes brandishing weapons. When searching for conventicles and women, other cases would undoubtedly be found, like at Amiens, of women and men participating in and sometimes leading them. James K. Farge found 12 cases of conventicles coming before the Parliament of Paris to 1547, and a further 66 times the justices warned against them. For psalm singing and service attendance, data could be culled to add to the instances noted previously, about a half dozen in the case of Rouen, Normandy. For women proselytizing, more testimonies could be searched for concerning women who were said to have taught or even to have preached privately or in public. Those instances could be then compared with the well-studied cases of Anabaptist and Quaker women proselytizing. It would also be important to look for women or their husbands owning Bibles and other religious books, which may point to various activities from private study to devotional group leadership. One of the husband and wife teams at Amiens had unspecified heretical books. In 1555, a woman was fined for having copies of the Genevan Catechism and its service book, the Forme des Prières Ecclésiastiques. She likely either participated in or led some sort of private Reformed teaching or services. Data about French women and men owning religious books has already been compiled from wills for the pre-Reformation era, as well as for the post-Reformation English men and women to about 1700 in this database that I have on screen here. The same type of survey of book ownership evidence could be done for Reformation era France. Finally, the data on all instances of noble women and men protecting conventicles and harboring heretics, as at Amiens, Rouen, Bourges, and Meaux, could be compiled, adding to these to the list of Protestant noble women collected by myself and a couple of other scholars. It would be possible to try and plot the number, timing, interconnection, and impact of these nobles' interventions. From the data, one could create genealogies and prosopographies of female letters stretching from the generation of pre-Reformation pious foremothers like Anne of France and Louise of Savoy into the Reformation era, tracing from Marguerite of Navarre and her daughter Jeanne d'Albret to Jeanne's daughter Catherine de Bourbon, all of whom stayed true to and led the cause after their brothers or husbands turned against it, on to the hundreds of noblewomen connected with them. It would be pertinent to inquire how effective their protection was, and particularly if their actions inspired non-elite women along the way. With results from research on all these fronts and more acts of and more topics, acts of iconoclasm, seeking refuge abroad, writing and publishing, and the like, all that data appropriately tagged and ordered, one could search for patterns, not absolute sums or percentages, which we can never hope to obtain, and then correct them for the source biases noted previously, revising upward in the analysis the number and frequency of common men, and especially women, acting to promote their new faith. Corrective indices could be created, um, would need to be established to guide our estimates of the extent to which women's activities were covered in the account of men's. These corrective ratios would be built by comparing interrelated sources like the Amya lists of Reformed converts and baptisms. From this process data, one could plot the data over time and place and social space, generating heat maps, frequency graphs, timelines, maps, and other representations that tell at a glance the story of their collective action. It would be possible and important to compare such findings with those for common folk in other times and places. From all this data, a collective narrative could be written. But until such expansive research and judicious analysis is done, only best guesses can be made based on anecdotal evidence about women's leadership and followership. Are the instances other scholars have turned up so far exemplary of broad trends or rare exceptions to that era's iron rules of hierarchy and patriarchy? Women singing the Psalms circa 1560 was undeniably widespread, but how common was it for women to proselytize or even to preach? To be sure, however, based on the strong evidence of women's participation in conventicles and in public manifestations, it is clear, um, it is certain that women were, along with common men, involved en masse, and that they themselves did much of the building of the movement. Without women and children, no Reformation in France. Better evidence is needed, however, about the patterns of their engagement before colorful anecdotes about some of them can be held up as the face of the experience of the hundreds of thousands of mostly nameless everyday women who helped build the Reformed churches by 1562. Modern everyday women and men equipped with new digital tools may be the ones to answer that call. Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing now and just let you just say this may have been a little disappointing. You were probably wanting the answer, and really the title for this presentation should have been something like a history yet to be written, digital humanities prospects for doing it better. But that's the state of things based on the problem of evidence. And I'm prepared to show you with a test case how I think this can work operationally and the types of things that it might turn up. But maybe we could stop just at this point and see if anybody had any questions or wanted to probe or get some clarification.
Karen Ziff has a question.
Hi, Karen.
Hi, I'm so excited about this. This is I really, first of all, love the OCR approach you're doing to this. It's really inspiring, and it's something that I would like to learn how to do more of. And I just think it's incredible how you're finding so much information about thousands of women's activities in that period. And I'm working on that period a little bit too in this witch hunt class that I'm teaching. Which there's so much overlap. We have to sit down and talk, but there's so much
Sure.
overlap. But there's one area that you might even OCR a little bit more on, and that's on midwifery.
Okay.
Because what I found in the witch hunt class is that, especially in this period in France, 1550s, there's a lot of distrust over women healers, especially midwives. They are the ones who, of course, help the birth of the babies, and then they clean the baby. And then what often happens is they give up, while they're cleaning the baby, they give a prayer to the baby. And the most famous example of this is Agnes Sampson in England, who was burned at the stake for precisely this, heretical problem with the and her connect what was believed to be her connection to the devil. So
Hmm.
what is the way that's being viewed by the 1550s is that it's a pact. It's the a pact that the midwife has with the devil in baptizing the baby in the name of the devil. When it's really just, a woman who's giving a Protestant prayer.
Right.
And you can even find Agnes Sampson's prayer, probably Googling it online, Agnes Sampson's prayer, just like that, probably would come up, and you can see all of her references
Hmm.
to Christ and all this stuff. So there is this fear that midwives, as this pact with the devil fear really begins to snowball after the 1530s, 1540s, and during all those peasant wars that are going on in that period, there's this fear that midwives are in league with the devil. So much so that in France in 1556, the French authorities in Paris actually require women to register their pregnancies. There's a pregnancy register
Hmm.
somewhere. I don't know where. I haven't seen it, but that's what I'm reading about. And also, even before the pregnancy register, they're requiring women healers to license with the state in France, in Germany and France, and I think also in Italy at some point.
Wow.
They are requiring women who are midwives to license, and then they can put them through training so they can serve as spies for the state instead of as heretics. So
That's
those
great.
are there's some really crazy stuff that's going on in that, so in that profession, that might show that women might have actually been, um, as Protestants and even sometimes as Catholic lay people, the ones who were to administer the rites of birth, maybe the sacrament of birth, the birth sacraments, or just a prayer when there's no priest available.
Hmm.
It's very possible that some communities permitted that, and that was considered heretical to these hardliners who are becoming more and more, inquisitive, the Inquisition. But anyway, I'll stop there. But I can't wait to talk to you more about it.
Great. Thank you. Yeah, there's some very interesting lines there, especially with regard to emergency baptisms that happened at times.
Kind of jumping off of what Karen was saying, I find it interesting that in France, I mean, we had the burning times in Europe, but in France, it seemed like witchcraft was not, this was by the 1870s or so, seen as an exceptional crime. And so, while you had a lot of women being executed, if you would, around Europe. In France, it was different. They saw witchcraft as differently, and then later even Louis XIV said that witchcraft is just fraudulent magic. So there was something different going on in France that's fascinating to me as well. So I'm looking forward to future stuff on that as well from both of you, from you and Karen.
Hmm. Yeah, that's the big thing there is the women and men had different spheres of agency, some
Mhm.
official and some seen as unofficial or suspected, like witchcraft, which is, generally there were very few who actually consider themselves that way. And just to riff off what you were saying, Karen, the whole involvement of women in the life cycle, what's the life cycle of human beings and their key role at each stage, which you were pointing to in birth, and that was something that when I went into this project wasn't high on my radar. And you're actually anticipating something that I was going to get to with another example where I had gone to the registers, ecclesiastical registers of another town, and I was looking for these sort of formal things of women owning Bibles or being involved in conventicles. And what I kept on stumbling on was all these cases of disputes about women and where they were going to baptize their children. And the husbands, and there's this whole gender dynamic that goes in there. And that extends from birth to death. And I just can't help sharing it because I shared it with my wife, and she was um, she thought this was and other people I've told about this thought it was a great example. I'm going to just show you quickly one example. It's in the French, but where I was taking a totally new set of sources that I'd never encountered except for a month ago. It's an PDF thing that I was able to use searches with key terms, that I was looking for women and psalms to find things like psalm singing, which I'd been talking about before. And when I was using the search term women, I come across this one case where it's in French, but I'll summarize it. There's a guy who dies without receiving last rites. And so the Catholics of this town, Beaune, don't want him to be buried in holy ground because he's not a Catholic and shouldn't be there. And this involves the mayor and the town councilors or whatever. But somehow someone buried him that day about 10 or 11 at night in the cemetery of Saint Pierre in the charnel house or mass grave for women who died in childbirth. The next morning, on the 23rd, a big group of women, honorable women and good Catholics, complaining about the injury done to them, trooped over to the charnière, to this mass grave, and one of them, they lifted off the stone cover of this, and one of them, who is great with child, puts a cord, a rope around the neck of the corpse and drags it out, and they drag it over to the convent of the Franciscans with these cries of, this Lutheran, this Huguenot, this dog, he doesn't deserve to be buried with good Christians. And eventually they take this corpse and go bury it near the temple, which is what the Protestant church is called. And in the examples that I got out of this that I didn't know, so many of them revolved around baptism, marriage, and burial, that I think that may be a privileged place for me to see more of women's agency in this time period.
Oh my gosh, that's unbelievable. What a story. Oh
Yeah,
my gosh.
I didn't know has anyone ever encountered in their literature women who die in childbirth being buried in a special part of a cemetery? And I
No, but I mean, I would think that in the Catholic respect, where they're not getting, where they die in childbirth and they don't have a priest there to get last rites, they would. That's interesting. The creation of that, the sort of, how did women, how did that evolve? That's fascinating.
Yeah, there's one other right related to women is the churching of women, which women after postpartum women were considered unclean. They were considered potentially dangerous to crops and animals as well when they were great with child, and were often sequestered for a long period of time. And they only came out of that enclosure to go to the church and be sort of ritually cleansed and brought back into the church and the community. And it was usually a longer waiting period for those who gave birth to daughters than to sons. And that was one of the reasons why women were very often not present at the baptism of their own children, because that period was longer than the usual waiting time for baptism. So I'm
Yes,
wondering if
I was actually in fact told that once by a Greek Orthodox priest. Another Greek Orthodox priest told me I was fine.
you're
But
not
one Greek
revealing.
Orthodox priest who was a hardliner, yeah, told me that I was, the purpose of the 40-day blessing was to in part cleanse the mother and allow her to re-enter the church.
So it still goes on. So this is
It still goes
revealing
on.
family secrets.
Yeah.
Does anybody else have any questions? Everybody's mighty quiet today.
That's fine. This is pretty far afield of both the problematic. There's so many more sources for the modern period for women's movements and the like, and that's the big dilemma that I'm facing. The reason why there's not a lot of literature actually out about everyday women in the Reformation era, and so it's going to be a tough nut to crack.
For sure.
It's very interesting research, Jonathan.
Thanks, Susan. Cheers.
Thank you so
So
much,
without-
Jonathan. That's awesome. I'm very
Great. Well,
excited.
thank you all for attending, and if you have any brainwaves down the line, especially about digital humanities and how to actually operationalize this idea of gathering lots of PDFs and doing word searches that get us to, you know, the types of sources that can help advance our research and operationalize that, I'd be very keen to hear your ideas. So thank you very much for coming.
Thank you, Jonathan.
This was
Cheers.
fascinating. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Cheers. Thank you, everyone.
Mhm.
All right.